Hello, everyone, and welcome to this office hour session. Today, we are talking about perfecting the product review with our very own Mihika Kapoor, the founding PM of Figma Slides. So excited to dig in with y'all. So I am very delighted to introduce you all to Mihika Kapoor. I'm sure many of you already know of her and have seen her talk in other capacities, and she is a true joy to work with as a product manager and a true expert in her field. So she has hosted probably hundreds of product reviews at this point and has many best practices she's gathered over those years that she's bringing to you all today. So with that, Mihika, I'm so excited to kick it over to you to talk about perfecting the product review.
Thanks so much, Katie. Hey, everyone. So excited to be here with you today to chat more about product reviews. Thank you all for dialing in, and hopefully you'll find this session fun. Some context. As Katie mentioned, I'm Mihika, founding PM for Figma Slides. I originally joined Figma as the second PM on FigJam, and so have consistently been focused on building 0 to 1 products at the company. Really passionate about that and excited to be chatting with you. So today we're going to cover 3 different types of product review decks. In my mind, these are the 3 most important product review decks that you will make. So the first is effectively the vision deck. Here, your goal is to inspire your stakeholders. Vision decks are something that you will maybe do with your team once every 2 years, I would say, or once a year. It's a pretty infrequent deck. And the goal is to ensure that as you guys embark on taking on a new space or rethinking an existing space, you're all marching in the same direction. The second is a strategy deck. This is like more tactical. We normally make these like monthly or quarterly at Figma. And the goal of a strategy deck is to basically lay out within a given half or quarter what part of your vision are you marching towards, and what does success look like. The third type of deck is a decision-making deck. These can either happen on a standard weekly, bi-weekly cadence or can happen ad hoc. And these are when you're trying to work with your kind of like stakeholders, managers, et cetera, to drive towards a decision and solicit feedback. There is a fourth kind of deck that people traditionally use for product reviews, which is like an informational deck. Here, the goal is to inform your stakeholders of things that your team might be doing. One thing I wanted to call out is that I actually recommend that informational decks do not take up product review slots. And I think instead informational decks are best done in asynchronous format. So we won't be covering informational decks today, but they are incredibly important and incredibly effective at moving work forward without necessarily getting everyone onto a Zoom call or into a meeting room. Okay, so with that, let's get started with the vision deck. So for the vision deck today, I thought I would actually start by sharing the original Figma Slides, or as we internally call it, Flides vision deck, and walk you through what that journey was like. For some context, Figma Slides actually started out as a hackathon project in October 2022. This was the sticky that I made in our FigJam pitch session, where I was pitching Slides, aka Flides, a tool that combined the visual fidelity of Figma with the interactive feedback mechanisms of FigJam. And so Slides was something that I had personally built a lot of conviction in by talking to a number of folks who worked in tech. And I was really passionate and excited about potentially turning it into our company's next standalone product. This is a little preview into what my Loom, or what our team's Loom looked like, which was we basically faked that Maker Week presentations were due and we hadn't started. And great news, we had this new tool, Slides, that could get us going. The Maker Week project was exceptionally effective in galvanizing and creating excitement within the company. You can see Dylan, Yuki, Chris, et cetera, more, and the entire company really getting so excited that we took on an entire product in effectively like a 3-day hackathon. And I exited this week so excited to see the amount of support that this was internally getting within the company. And what basically happened was, going out of this review or going out of the Maker Week, I put together a deck with the team on why and how Figma could win in the storytelling space. Talked about putting together a tool that had the visual control of Figma and the interactive storytelling mechanisms of FigJam. and basically talked about how no existing player in the market really satisfied all the core needs as yet. And I thought that we did a hackathon project that people were excited about. Great, that should give us the green light to move ahead. And instead, we actually got a bit of pushback from Dylan, who's Figma CEO. And he really challenged us on, if this product is successful, what does the world look like? And Dylan's point was, when you take on a new space, when you take on a new product, you shouldn't do so simply because you think that you can outdo the competition. You need to have a very concrete perspective as to, if you are in North Star state and you have made the change that you hope to see in the world, like, what does that change look like? And how does that change, and incrementally, or like, how does that create a step change in the way that people are working today? And so I think piece of advice number one for the vision deck starts even before you start putting together the deck, and it's more in the ideation phase. And it's basically to be a challenger. Don't just look at what people are doing already and think, how can we do that better? Think about what is the unique perspective that you would put on the space. And in January of last year, we put together a small vision sprint squad. So that was me on product, our fabulous designer Kian on design, Gus on research, and Alex on engineering. And what we basically did was we wanted to put together a concrete vision as to what we were marching towards as a company. And the goal of the vision was to basically get and solicit a go, no go on this space. And so most of you are probably familiar with something like this diagram. It's a traditional like product development cycle waterfall diagram. Start with research, learn about your customers, then move over to design, then move over to engineering, and you basically do a handoff at each stage. Now, I think one thing that's really important is I actually don't recommend taking the traditional playbook of this when putting together a vision. I actually recommend being like as scrappy as possible. And in our case, the scrappiness was forced because we were on the clock and we had a deadline of a month for putting together this vision. And so what we did was we basically parallelized research, design, and engineering. And in terms of how we were able to actually do all of these things simultaneously, I once got a piece of feedback from Yuki, who's the chief product officer at Figma, who recommended when you go and you're basically charting out uncharted territory, you actually want to go in with an A- idea. And so what does that really mean? So normally sometimes when you might get started on a product, you might think, I'm going to start from ground zero. I'm going to start with nothing. I'm going to hear from my customers, and then I'm going to use that to build up. And what actually happens is that if you instead parallelize everything and you go into research with a set of hypotheses as to where you think the product could go, what actually happens is you get a much stronger reaction when you talk to folks as to, yes, this is definitely what I want, or no, this is definitely what I don't want. Versus if they're reacting to nothing, you get more lukewarm reactions. And what you want to do is basically polarize your users. And so what we did was on day zero, we started doing foundational research and we started designing that A- idea. And what we did every day was we basically, as we had designs, put those ideas in front of research. And then as we learned things in research, iterated on those designs. And that A- idea changes a lot, but you need to be willing to be bold and solicit those very polarizing opinions from your users. And then on the engineering side, what we did during the vision sprint was we actually didn't build slides. Instead, what we did was we were technically de-risking the areas that we had the most conviction in to ensure that they were in fact technically feasible for us to pursue. And so now to talk about the actual deck. So this is the first slide in the deck. We called it Slides. It was our vision for building a standalone storytelling tool that unlocks your team next step. This is like a bird's eye view as to what the deck looked like. It was made in Figma since slides didn't exist at the time. But this was basically the like broad shape of the deck, so to speak. And internally, after we presented this deck, it popped off and went viral within the company, which was really exciting. I think in particular, one thing that I really recommend when putting together a vision deck is to bring your entire team together. So I think a lot of times you might have coming out of a vision sprint, like an independent research deck, an independent design crit, an independent product review deck. But really what you want to do is have the whole team working towards a single deliverable that is reflective of the research, the design, the product insights, as well as the engineering cost in order to really create a singular team perspective on what to take on. So for the deck making part, first piece of advice, always set context. And so context should be very short, should be very brief, but should be very comprehensive and grounding people who might not know anything about what you've been working on as to what you're talking to them about. So in our case, we were effectively presenting the vision to the Figma C-suite. And what we did was we basically talked about how in January, we spun up a small pod to sprint on slides. And we were hoping to basically make a go/no-go decision on the investment in the space. We talked about how we had been spending our time. And in particular, we had a goals and non-goals slide. I think that this is one of the most important things you can put into any product review. I think it's very normal for folks to put goals into product reviews. I think it's less common for folks to put non-goals in, but I actually think non-goals are even more important because they prevent rabbit holing on things that you might not be ready to solicit feedback on as yet. So in our case, our vision was full of mocks and prototypes, but the pixel level feedback was not what we were looking for because these were more concepts rather than end specs. Okay, next piece of advice. Lead with the delta. Now, what does this mean? When you take on a new space, or when you take on any space in general, you can generally distill the work that you need to do into two parts. First is table stakes, and second is differentiators. Now, when you're actually building the product, both of these are so important, right? If you build a product that's like all differentiators, no table stakes, you're not even going to get people in the door. So one example of this is like we learned that for a slide making tool, having a single slide view and not just the bird's eye view was very critical to helping people who are unfamiliar with the Figma ecosystem get oriented. And that was simply a table stakes thing. On the other hand, we have a whole bunch of features that only Figma Slides have, and that's ultimately why people would choose to use your product. And so even though both of these things are like fundamentally critical to what you're building at the end of the day, when you are telling a story about the vision or to think back the change that you're hoping to see in the world, you want to effectively lead with that change. And so what does this look like? We had a small section at the top of the deck, which was basically dedicated towards communicating the delta that we were trying to address. So we had one section which was talking about how historically slides tools have been used to set the stage. And modern tools that have come since perpetuate this traditionally one-way presentation format. And so if you talk to anyone who's ever made a slide deck, they tell you that the biggest pain point is the fact that they're spending like 8 hours or something exorbitant on a deck. And so most tools that have come into the space have said, okay, we're going to take that, we're going to make it better. However, at the same time, if you think about why you are ever making a presentation, it's in service of an outcome, right? If we're thinking about why you're doing a product review, it's in service of either, like we said, inspiring or making a decision or things like that. And generally speaking, the reason people get so frustrated is because they spend all of this time and then they don't even get to the outcome that they wanted, right? Like you end up rabbit holing, you end up not knowing if everyone is aligned. You're like, okay, you asked me a question, but are you on board? And so people, first of all, spend so much time and then don't even get to the outcomes that they want. And so we were basically like, we want to not just make deck making faster, but we want to effectively unlock every team's next step. We want to make it so easy for you to go from the information you have to the information you need that we're able to help teams move faster, more efficiently, and more democratically. And this spanned both the presentation experience and the creation experience, right? So on the presentation side, we wanted to not just build a tool for stories, but really a tool for conversations, and we'll talk more about that later. And then on the creation side, we really wanted to deliver on that Figma promise. And what is the Figma promise? It's basically the idea that this is the place and this is the platform where you can create the most stunning decks in the least amount of time. And so reducing that time to make slide decks was still incredibly important. But the sort of more controversial piece was the fact that we wanted to change the fact that slides tools have historically been like very one-way, distributed via a screen share, etc. Piece of advice number 5 is really know your audience. every leader is very different, right? And every leader will want decks presented in a very specific way. And it is really worth getting to know what that way is. So in the context of Figma, I got a few pieces of advice when pulling together this deck with my collaborators. The first was from Yuki and Chris, our CTO, which was they were like, hey, just so you know, like Dylan might stop paying attention to this deck. And so what actually happened was this traditionally very top heavy deck where if you think about most product reviews, it's like all the context, then all the problems, then all the learnings, then your goals. And then maybe you get to the solution at the end as the like capstone on it all. It doesn't really float and doesn't really work inside of this company. And so instead, what we did was we effectively flipped the presentation to what you saw, which was we spent maybe 2 minutes of the entire review on setting the stage and the rest of it on what are we building. And we didn't present we presented like an incredibly little amount of research up front. And what we did was we instead threaded it, both the research and the pain points through the entire deck. And I'll talk a little bit what that looks like. The second piece of feedback that I got from Yuki was the importance of making people feel. And so effectively, each of the sections inside this, to clarify for Mihika, which part of the process are you referencing? Can you clarify, Katie?
Don't worry about that. That's for Q&A later.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay. So basically what we did was each chapter of the deck was grounded in helping people step into a different set of shoes. Imagine you're the presenter. Presenting is nerve-wracking. Now, let's say you're creating. You have limited design skills. Maybe design skills are your superpower. Let's say you had a conflict with your meeting. And there were all of these instances where we were putting the audience in the user's shoes so that they truly felt the pain points. Another piece of feedback was I got from Sho, who's our VP of product, which was to use marketing language so that the audience feels like the user. We have this sort of running thing within our company, which is Dylan and a lot of our company now thinks in tweets. So it's basically, what would you say not to your manager about what you want to build? So you wouldn't say, oh, I want to build a feature that does this. And instead, what we did was imagine you're talking directly to your users and you're telling the users, you can engage users with a two-way dialogue. You can build a source of truth. You can, when presenting, conduct from a command center. When you're creating, you can nail your story arc. You can build with design that can't be broken, and you can also tap into your design superpowers. And so basically going really direct and talking to the user, even though they might not be the actual audience for your presentation, does a lot to ground people and make them truly feel. And the last piece of advice for building a vision deck is words really aren't that powerful. Mocks, prototypes, designs, that's where the power is. And so here are some of the prototypes from the original vision deck that were put together by our phenomenal designer, Kian. Here you can see the early innings of alignment scales and poles that were basically set to change how people were running their presentations. I want to call out that this was actually the part of concept testing where we saw the biggest delta between foundational testing and actually showing them the concepts. In foundational testing, people said, yeah, like it's annoying when I don't get to my outcomes, but that's on me. That's because I structured the discussion wrong. When we put this in front of them, they were like, wow, this could be really incredible in getting even the quietest people on my team talking. This was early easy access to mocks and prototypes. We suspected from the beginning that having a very interoperable ecosystem and relationship with Figma Design and FigJam would be really critical to getting things to take off. And so we really leaned into that. Here is our first pass at what presenter mode might look like. And here's the infamous tone dial in its original form. And what I thought I would do is basically walk you through one of the like mini situations that we put people into. So this was basically the situation that set up the interactivity that we're proposing inside of slides. So imagine we're in the product review. You say, the PM poses the question. The entire conversation is deep in debate, but it's 2 to 3 people who are deep in debate. The rest of the Zoom is silent. And anyone who sees this is, yeah, I've been there. I've been either like the one person that's like arguing endlessly on the call, or I've been sitting in silence while people are like making me late for my next meeting. And it's so painful. And then it's, okay, it's 10:36. You ran out of time. That's pretty awkward. And you still have no idea where anyone stands. I cannot tell you the number of times that I have been in a product review like this. And so then we showed, wouldn't it be great if you had the ability to solicit feedback from your entire audience, not just the folks who are basically like loud enough to be on Zoom. And then what we did was we layered in the research insights as to what we heard and reactions to each of these features. And so if we go back and take that again, every part of the deck was basically like pain point, right? Where you really feel the pain point, mock/prototype, where we proposed our solution, and then proof point. And it was like a rinse and repeat of pain point, solution, proof point, pain point, solution, proof point. And this was really key to the know your audience piece, right? Because if we put all of the pain points up front and then showed all of the designs and then justified all of the proof points, that would not have been as dynamic of a presentation. Okay, second is strategy deck. Now with the strategy deck, your goal is basically to align your audience. So what I'm going to actually do here is walk through one of the presentations that we have published as a template that was made internally by someone at the company. And so if you want to try out the strategy deck, you can go ahead. It's directly on it's like in our template picker as well as available on community. So let's say we're doing a mobile strategy review. I think one of the most important things to do for any product review is to set the agenda. And again, as I said, set the goals and the non-goals. I think this is consistent between the vision and the strategy decks. You will always want to be setting goals and non-goals. So let's say you're talking about the goals. Generally speaking, this kind of deck will take a very different shape to a vision deck. Vision decks can be long. Vision decks can be ambitious and immersive and all of these things. Strategy decks, on the other hand, want to be incredibly to the point. And what you're going to do is you're going to basically hear the context setting is to remind people of the vision, right? Which is, we had this vision at one point in time. This is the high level of what that vision looked like. And now we have basically 3 goals in service of that vision. Then you'll want to talk about how you'll win, right? The strategy deck is strategic. It's basically saying that we learned for this point in time that this is what we need to do. And we heard that these were the pain points. In terms of how we'll win, we will take on these areas. And then lastly is the what we're building. And so here, again, what you're going to do is this thing of, hey, words aren't that powerful. Mocks, prototypes, visuals, those are the things that will make people really understand, one, what you're trying to do, and 2, it means that you and your executives or you and your managers are on the same page about what you are building, right? When you're describing things in words, it's very easy for you to like have maybe like a 50% or a 60% shared understanding of what you're marching towards. When you have mocks and prototypes, that snaps to 90+%. And so we have the ability for you to copy paste in mocks and prototypes. We also have these helpful device frames inside of the template if you want to make them look nice. And we have the ability for you to copy and paste any prototyping link and copy that into your deck such that users, when you are in presentation mode, can actually engage with how you are envisioning the product to look like. And then you can end with Q&A. And so just to recap, vision deck sets your like 2 years, let's say. Strategy deck sets your half or your quarter. And that's basically saying, of the vision that we're marching towards, these are the biggest blockers right now. This is how we're going to tackle them. And this is what this looks like. And here the goal is to get feedback on that proposal and align. And last but not least, there is the decision-making kind of meeting where your goal is to solicit feedback. Now, this is, I think, where you can leverage Figma Slides in order to create basically the biggest delta in how you are currently doing presentations today. I think historically, presentations have very much been a jumping off point for a broader conversation, right? You go and you present, and then you have a discussion with the rest of the call or the rest of the room that's entirely disconnected from the deck. Now, this has a few downsides, right? One is that anyone who wasn't actually in that call or in that room has absolutely no idea what was discussed. The only thing that they have is the context, right? So that's one shortcoming. The second shortcoming is what we were just discussing about. Normally, it's either the loudest or the most senior person on the call that's chiming in, and you have actually no idea who else might have a thoughtful opinion that might change the way that you're thinking about things. So it's fundamentally not super efficient. And so I'm going to talk about how you can leverage the interactivity inside of slides. And we have an interactivity section in the tool belt in order to make the most of your product reviews. So the first tip here is actually to lean into the concept of a pre-read. I think one of the biggest problems with pre-reads today is that it's really common that you send a pre-read and then maybe half of your audience reads it. This isn't great because this means that you're basically having either a fragmented discussion where not everyone has context in the meeting itself, or it means that you're going to effectively rehash the entire deck because maybe like certain people are not caught up to speed. And fundamentally, there's not really any accountability for doing the pre-read. And so this is why we recommend leveraging something like our Facepile flap in order to see and hold everyone accountable for having done the deck and for concentrating the discussion or concentrating the meeting on the meat, which is the discussion. So this is like one piece of interactivity that you can use. Now, let's say you have this decision-making deck. I think that decision-making decks have a similar shape to vision decks in that it's very little context. And instead of focusing the bulk of the meeting on the inspiration, you're just going to focus it on the decision-making and debating and discussing, and ideally creating a record for anyone who's hoping to understand what actually took place in that meeting. So let's say you have the beginning setup, you see who's done the pre-read, you have the context, nothing new here. And then you have your discussion questions, right? This is going to be the meat of the presentation. So we're going to walk through 3 different types of ways that you can frame your discussion questions. The first is basically like an either or, right? Let's say you have 2 different concepts. You have 2 different directions that you can go in, and you want to solicit feedback from your management team, or maybe from your like broader team, or maybe from a cross-functional stakeholder as to which way you should go. So you can show concept A, you can show concept B, lay out the merits of each, and basically get people's opinion. And so what happens here is that you can see basically like where the tides are headed. And what we actually recommend doing is when you are in a review where you're seeing people gravitate towards a certain direction, you probably want to give the floor to the person who has voted for the less popular idea to voice their opinion first, because they're probably thinking about something that no one else is thinking about. And what's really great is you're able to understand like, hey, is this a really polarizing decision? Or is this like a very straightforward decision? And this is something that you can't really do without a poll, because if you just launch a question to the room, either you're greeted in silence or you're greeted in a very small fraction of the people that might not be representative of the broader call giving their feedback. Now, the second thing that I recommend is the concept of a traffic light chart. So we have tables inside of Figma Slides, and we're also working to improve these over time. But in my opinion, traffic light charts are basically the single most, or one of the single most helpful tools in order to ensure that you and your stakeholders are on the same page. I once got a piece of advice very early in my career, which I think to this day is one of the best pieces of advice that I've gotten. And the piece of advice was basically from Julie Zhu, who is the first intern MVP of design at Facebook. And she said that if 2 people disagree on strategy, it is because they have different assumptions. And so what a traffic light chart does, it allows you to effectively create a visual of your assumptions for your stakeholders. And so let's say you're debating 3 different options. What you can basically do is lay out what you think are the various vectors or criteria by which you should evaluate those options, as well as the priority. And then it becomes quite an objective discussion, right? Like you're able to see here literally like option 1 has 1 green, 2 yellows. That's looking way better than option 2 or option 3. And then when you're debating with the rest of your team or you're debating with any of your stakeholders, you're actually going to be concentrating the discussion on these vectors, right? Because either it's someone disagrees with you on the priority of something, or someone thinks that there's a criteria that is not currently included in the chart, which then you can include into the chart. But basically what this does is it allows you to visualize all of the assumptions. And then when you again use the poll for something in order to get feedback from your audience, you're taking a much more informed decision. And if you continue to see a split here, you have the ability to go back to your traffic light chart and basically debug exactly where you have different assumptions from the rest of your working group. Another thing that we love to use is the alignment scale. So the alignment scale, for folks of you who are very familiar with FigJam, was actually something that started out in FigJam. And we are internally addicted to alignment scale. They are how we make most of our decisions as a company. And so let's say there aren't two options, right? Let's say there's one leading proposal from the team. And let's say that leading proposal is concept C. What you can then ask people is to what extent they are aligned with the proposal. And you have the ability to hide results so that people aren't biased by what other people are voting on, or to show results. So if everyone could go ahead and just stamp your face on this. The most effective way that we recommend using the alignment scale is to actually take the person who has the most green and the person who has the most red, and then have them both voice their opinions. So here I can see Jeff is the person who has the most red on the strongly disagree side. And I'm so sorry, I do not know who this is, but I see that Katie is near the strongly agree side. And so I could basically open the floor to Jeff and Katie. And because they are so extremes on the spectrum, you can almost guarantee that you're giving the talk time to someone who has a thought that is either representative of what the folks near them are thinking about, or if they're, in this case, like an outlier, they might be thinking of something that everyone else is not thinking about. And so instead of, like I said, giving the talk time to the loudest or the most senior person on the call, you're giving it to the person who is most likely to change the way that people are thinking, which is what you want to do, because you want to, like, it's no point basically debating things that people already agree on. You want to concentrate the discussion where people don't. And so this is just a start of what we think about internally as quote unquote two-way storytelling. We're going to be launching many more features in this space over time, and we're excited to help you both spin up decks fast, as well as turn the potential directions into decisive decisions. And with that, I think we can turn it over to Q&A.
Yes, absolutely. So we have a few questions that have already come in. Mihika, I have those ready for you. But if anyone else has questions, please go ahead and open up that Zoom Q&A feature and pop your questions in there. We'll be surfacing as many as we can in the next 20 minutes here to get your questions answered from Mihika here. So Mihika, with that, let's go to the next slide and dig in. You just showed us how to reveal the results for the alignment scale. Tess asked a question about the poll. She mentioned that you talked about giving space to people with the less popular opinions in the poll, but she's curious, like, how do I see that using the poll here in Figma Slides? Yes, and I believe, Mahika, if you hover over, you can see, you just leave it hovered, it'll show you the little drop down of the people. So that might potentially be in way the one that has the less votes here. You could pull in someone from that list potentially.
Yes.
Awesome. And then we have another question, Mihika, from Michaela on the next slide, who says, this might be obvious, but thinking about how most of my stakeholders don't have Figma accounts, can they still interact with Figma Slides if I share the deck with them? Thinking interactive features could be very helpful, but they're curious how to use it with folks like marketing partners who may not have Figma accounts yet.
Yes, that is a great question. So two things. One is that you actually have the ability on your presentations to set viewing to anyone. And so that is basically a setting that you can do in presentation mode. And so rather than setting it to anyone in your company with the link, you can set it to anyone with the link. And so that allows you to do that. The second thing is that if anyone in your organization has Google accounts or emails, it's actually like quite simple for them to create a Figma account. And since Slides is free for everyone through end of year, like they don't need to pay anything. And also, even once it becomes a charged product, people will be able to view and interact with decks without having a seat. And so we made it such that anyone, even people without an editor seat, are actually able to engage with all of the interactivity and polls.
Awesome. Love that. We have some questions, Mihika, about the process that you went through and these different product reviews that you talked about running yourself. The first one is a great question from Vincent asking about content designers. They're curious, were content designers part of the team during this build process? They mentioned that you were showing like decks are storytelling, and so they're curious how, if at all, content designers are part of that process.
Yeah. So we have a content designer on our team, Rye, who's absolutely phenomenal. They were basically behind not just a lot of basically all of the content inside of Figma Slides, but we're also critical in getting our templates feature off the ground. And so I think at Figma, content designers are an absolutely integral part of the process. And yeah.
Awesome. Yes, can't speak highly enough of Rye. They're fantastic. Great. The next question we have here is from Ahana Higa. They ask, how do you deal with overwhelming negative feedback from stakeholders during your presentations? Is there anything different you might do in Figma Slides in this situation? And just in general, what's your approach to handling that?
Yeah. So I have two thoughts here. One is that I think this is actually where the power for pre-read really comes into play, right? Because let's say you present something and no one in the room agrees with you. That's actually something you should probably resolve before the review. And I think in that instance, it's either one of two things. One is you need to revisit your approach. And two is that like your approach is right and you're simply like presenting the information in a suboptimal way. That's basically like two outcomes. I think that if you have part negative feedback, part positive feedback, that's actually like ripe for discussion, right? That's where things like alignment scales and polls and things like that really come into play. And so I think that that's actually like a great ground for a debate. And I think that the last thing that I would say is it's important to, I would say, over time, train your stakeholders and your team on like how to give feedback. I think that's also like really important. And I think that with these interactive elements, you can actually ensure that you're specifically getting feedback on the things that you want to get feedback on, right? A lot of times people might give feedback during a presentation and you're like, oh, that wasn't even the part that I was trying to get feedback on. And that's like maybe something that's work in progress. And so like really using these tools to your advantage to basically channel the actual tension points that you're feeling in the product is very effective. And I think that like at a high level, I would pose a more existential question of what is negative feedback, right? There's constructive feedback, but negative feedback is, I don't know. If someone's saying, I don't like this, I would honestly push back on that and say, what are like the suggestions you have, or what are the problems here that you maybe don't agree with, and make it more constructive, because I think negative feedback in and of itself is never going to be that helpful.
Great advice. Thanks so much, Mihika. On the next slide, we have a question from Boris about being in a different type of organization. So they're wondering if you have thoughts on taking this approach for your first digital product if you're in a less established company. And they say a potential hindrance is identifying users for conducting user research or budget limitations. Do you have any advice from your experience there, Mihika?
Yeah. So I think that at Figma, we are like obsessed with talking to customers. And yes, we are fortunate to have like official research teams that are able to spin up official research sessions and such. But I think that is honestly just a piece of the puzzle when it comes to how we solicit feedback from our users. For example, so many folks in the company are like constantly on Twitter, constantly on LinkedIn, like really actively having DMing, hopping on Zoom calls with various clients and customers in order to get feedback. And so I actually think that like doing formal research sessions sometimes like it's very effective, but so is literally going and like having a conversation with your users directly without going through a researcher, right? That is also incredibly effective. And so Krista, who's like an absolutely phenomenal researcher on our team, ensures that whenever she hosts research sessions, it's not just her on the call, but it's actually the engineers, the PMs, the designers, like everyone else on the team, so that you're able to hear that those pain points first off, because that at the end of the day is going to be so much more powerful in impacting product development than hearing like a distillation or a summary of what people are saying.
Awesome. Thanks, Mihika. Great advice. Yes, again, can't speak highly enough of Krista either. And Krista recently did a presentation about running research readouts using Figma Slides, so you can find that on YouTube soon if you're interested to tune in. Next question here, Mihika, is from Dante. They say this is a great presentation, couldn't agree more, but they want to know how you're measuring success of Figma Slides.
So we're looking at a few things. We track weekly active users, weekly active editors, and retention. and also look at, how does using slides uplift the broader Figma ecosystem?
Fantastic. If you have any other follow-up questions on that, Dante, feel free to send them over. But the next question here is from Silas. They're curious how you're thinking about, so you talked about that kind of compressed time frame you did when you were originally in that vision sprint. And they're curious about how you think about getting the resourcing and avoiding wasting revs when you're in a compressed time frame like that.
Maybe a clarification here. What do you mean by wasted revs? Do you mean like pursuing directions that are ultimately discarded, or?
I can only assume from the question here, but I don't know if it's like engineers building things that aren't yet finalized or designers working on things that haven't yet been validated with research. So maybe just speaking to like how all three of those roles are working together at the same time.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I can actually speak to the engineering part first. So, one of the most critical things was like when we were in the validation phase, engineering was like not building for real, right? Like they were, Alex was effectively taking, we would have like very frequent meetings and we would chat through what are the product directions that we are building the most conviction in. And then we were checking and technically de-risking them. So for example, one of the most like controversial or engineering decisions back in the day was for presentation mode, do we build presentation mode on top of the prototype viewer in Figma, or do we build it on top of like the canvas? So the benefit of building on top of the prototype viewer is you get animations, you get prototypes, you get like a whole bunch of things there. But the downside was that it was very technically difficult to unlock like interactivity in the viewer, right? Because it was traditionally not a space where people could like engage with polls, alignment scales, etc. On the flip side, doing it inside of the editor, you can of course have all of these things. We've taken inspiration from FigJam. And so what we did was like we built more and more conviction that no, the viewer was in fact the place where we wanted to build presentation mode because the level of polish and animations that people expected was like very top bar. And so what we did was we basically like chased down several avenues looking how we would possibly, from a tech stack perspective, unlock interactivity in the viewer. And then we de-risked it, which kind of paved the path forward for moving forward. And so that wasn't actually building for real, but it was basically having a series of conversations, investigating, prototyping, et cetera. The other way that you can use engineering in the early phases is for building engineering prototypes. So for example, if you're debating two different directions on a product, you can do light prototypes of each and then put those prototypes in front of users in order to get signal as to what resonates better. So those are the various ways that you can, I think, leverage engineering in the early phases. As for like the relationship between design and research, basically how this went was for research, we started doing foundational research day zero, and we started designing day zero. And I was basically I was going to every research session and also meeting with Kian every single day. And so one thing to call out is that like your cycles and like your meeting schedules are going to be super compressed. So normally people like PMs and designers meet like once a week. Kian and I were meeting for an hour every day, and the rest of my day was spent like in research sessions with Gus. And so that ensured that there was this cross-pollination of like anytime we had a new hypothesis on the research side, that would get implemented in designs. And then anytime we like had some ideas on the design side, we would validate that in research. And so for the research, we spent 2 weeks doing foundational research. And then once 2 weeks later, we had the designs, we did concept testing, and then we iterated from there. But I think that I would, at a high level, generally like reframe from wasted revs, because if you design something that you have high conviction in and you learn that is not in fact the direction that you want to go in, that's like a learning. That's not like a wasted rev, in my opinion.
Yes, absolutely. That makes great advice. And thanks for digging into all of those different kind of roles and how you approached that. Fantastic advice there. The next few questions, we've had a few questions and interest, Mihika, come in about guests and about accessing the interactive components with current tool sets. So here, I'm wondering if maybe you can speak more generally. You already mentioned how to get folks into those slides and having everyone able to create accounts and try it out now in this beta period. But Mihika, do you have any other advice of like how to think about approaching it to get a variety of stakeholders or working in current tool sets like Zoom or Teams where teams might be meeting today already?
Yes, great question. So I'm not sure if y'all are aware, but for tools like FigJam, we actually have the ability to like create an interactive embed of a FigJam file inside of a Zoom window so that you can contribute to the file directly from Zoom. And we're actually planning to unlock that for Figma Slides in the near future as well. So that way people won't need to hop between Zoom and your browser. If you have your account linked, you can actually directly interact with it right there. And so that will hopefully allow you to present without compromising on like either the Zoom window or the presentation. And then as for guest mode, I think that's a good question. I think for now, we recommend that folks rely on basically like setting the viewership to anyone because it allows anyone to come in. The reason that we have open sessions in FigJam is because it requires in an open session, you're basically making people an editor, not a viewer, right? So you're letting them put stickies down on the canvas and create shapes and diagrams and all of those things versus when you're trying to get people into Figma Slides in the context of sharing a presentation. Mainly the two things that they need to do is be able to flip through the presentation and to be able to interact with the interactive elements. And what we did was we explicitly made that interactivity unlocked for viewer seats. So we hope that it'll be like less frictionful.
Awesome. Thanks for speaking that to me. We have 3 more questions. I don't know if I'll get any more, but we're actually probably gonna be out of time after that. Anyway, talk about templates, Mihika. Benny asked, do you templatize your product reviews to run a similar process each time you're doing each type of those decks you talked about? Or are you creating something custom for every new deck? And they mentioned specifically that your slides examples are very beautiful and look very custom.
Yeah, so the slides one was definitely done from scratch, but then that actually became the template that I used for most future slides product reviews. So I think that like when you're trying to be bold and ambitious and create something special, do it, go for it, run for it. But then I think templating is also incredibly important. So those black headers with the numbers and stuff like that are used in almost every product review deck since. I think you're muted, Katie.
Sorry, thank you. We have the next question from an anonymous attendee who's earlier in their career, and they wonder, Mihika, being someone with so much experience, do you have any advice for someone who's preparing to run their first product review?
Um,
What should they focus on most? There's lots of great advice in everything you've shared, but if you were to go back to the beginning, what would you recommend focusing on and really nailing that first time you run a review?
Yeah, this is maybe a cop-out answer, and I'm curious if the anonymous attendee wants to share what the goal of the product review is, but I think that it's very dependent on what your goal is, right? If you're trying to pitch a new product, that's going to be very different than like getting sign off on a feature within an existing product, which is going to be very different than like recommending a reprioritization of the roadmap, so on and so forth. I think in general, maybe like advice that would apply across all product reviews is definitely have the goals and non-goals slide. And I would actually say it's really important that you align with your manager slash leadership on the goals and non-goals ahead of the review. Because what, in my opinion, the least successful product reviews actually take place when you go in with a goal and then you're presenting to people who have no intention of accomplishing that goal in that meeting, right? Like that is like failure state for a review. And so I think that aligning on goals and non-goals is very useful. And then in the event that you are like getting sign off slash feedback on a new feature, like really like partner very closely with your designer in order to lay out the like key parts of the experience. I think that just gets people onto the same page.
Such great advice, whether you're early or late in your career. That's great advice for every product you're running. I wanted to slip in a quick follow-up question. People are really excited about this vision sprint, it sounds. And there's a quick question from Karen on how you essentially justified the cost of this. They want to know, were these people that were working on this doing this on top of other work they were doing, or were they fully dedicated? And how did you like essentially get buy-in from leadership to run that?
Yeah, so the folks on the vision sprint were full-time. And the way that we got buy-in was, I think, really through the hackathon project. right? So the hackathon project, I don't think that I could have one day been like, hey, can I just stop doing my regular work and explore this space? I think people would have been like, Mihika, what are you talking about? But I think that the hackathon project, and this is a perfect example of leveraging engineering in order to like get people to feel what you feel slash see what, or even a semblance of that in order to like be ready to take a bet on this.
And I'm going to actually plug Mihika's podcast interview with Lenny's on Lenny's podcast. Mihika did a fantastic podcast interview where she dug all into that of like how to get the buy-in, how to get the approval. Lots of advice there. So definitely check that out if you haven't listened to it already. But we're going to end on this question, Mihika from Georgie. Given all your experience and clear expertise, are there any parts that still feel challenging to you, and how do you think about overcoming them?
I am a really big procrastinator. And so honestly, even though I recommend pre-reads, I'm like really bad at sending pre-reads and then wasted in a review. And so I think that like generally speaking, pre-reads are incredible. And I don't use them as often as I should.
Great advice. Try to plan ahead, send those pre-reads if you can.
It
Awesome. Well,
works
thank
really
you.
well for the vision sprint because that's all like storytelling and narrative and stuff, and you want people to be surprised. But I think that definitely, getting the pre-reads out, I think is just, I think in general, like work is moving towards like a more asynchronous world. And I think that's part of why we're so excited about some of the interactive elements and slides is like, you can theoretically in the future run an asynchronous product review, solicit feedback from all the people you care about, and have that captured in the deck. And that's not something you were able to do before, but it's so efficient. And so as we grow closer and closer to that world, I think it's actually like really important that PMs and like other folks think about how they evolve their processes and keeping with that as well.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Thank you so much, everyone, for bringing these amazing questions to our conversation today. Mihika, I want to thank you so much for being here today and teaching us all about how to perfect the product review.
It was so fun chatting.
Awesome. Have a great day, everyone.